What would you do if you came home to your ranch and found a mansion sitting on your lake? I came back to my lakeside ranch after years away, only to find a steel and glass mansion sitting right on my family's shoreline. The HOA stood there telling me I was trespassing on my own land. But the deeper I dug, the clearer it became. Shifted boundaries, a stolen lake, and a whole scheme hiding behind it. That's when I decided. They were about to hear the truth straight from the land itself. The gravel under my tires sounded different than I remembered. The road leading into my family's ranch had always been rough, washed out by spring melt, rutted by cattle trucks, softened by years of rain rolling off the Wyoming hills. But this time was, as I eased my old pickup around the curve overlooking the lake, the sound didn't match the memory. It wasn't the loose, familiar crunch of stone under rubber. It was harder, flatter, almost paved. And then I saw why. The land opened up, and the first thing that hit me wasn't the sky or the long stretch of water, but a shape that didn't belong. A massive glass and steel mansion rose from the eastern bank of the lake, my lake, angles catching the morning sun like a blade. It sat exactly where the shoreline curved gently inward, the place where, when I was a kid, the water lapped against open meadow slow enough for deer to drink without flinching. Now there was concrete poured right up to the edge of the water. For a long moment, I just sat in the truck with my hands resting on the steering wheel. This place had always been untouched, a quiet corner of the world my uncle called God's pocket. The lake lay still in the cool morning air, its surface reflecting the peaks to the west, the same way it had for generations. But the mansion carved into that reflection like a wound, an intrusion so loud it seemed to hum in the stillness. I stepped out of the truck. The air smelled the same, pine, cold water, dust from the road. But the view was wrong, too sharp, too polished, too claimed. A wooden post stood in the dirt where the old property sign used to be. My family's sign had been simple: Coal Ranch, private land. It had hung there since before I could walk. Now a new sign gleamed with laser-etched lettering: Lake Ridge Estates, private community HOA. Managed, my jaw tightened. I hadn't given permission for this sign. I sure as hell hadn't approved any community. Nobody but my uncle and I had ever had the right to grant anything on this land. For years after his stroke, I'd been working out of state, consulting on water systems and dam repairs from Montana to Nevada. I'd sent money home, visited when I could, and after he passed, I kept paying taxes and upkeep even while living mostly on the road. The ranch was supposed to be preserved the way he taught me: quiet, protected, untouched. Yet here it was, touched in the worst possible way. I walked toward the lake, boots sinking slightly into soil that should have felt familiar. But even the ground had changed. Tire tracks from heavy machinery were pressed deep into the earth, dried into ridges like scars. I crouched to run my hand across one, too wide for ranch trucks. These were from construction crews. The mansion loomed across the water, 3 stories, maybe 4, depending on how the slope beneath it was used. Giant windows, a cantilevered deck jutting out over the shoreline like a ship's bow. And below it, I noticed something that made my stomach twist even tighter. A concrete pier extending into the water, complete with cleats and a small floating dock. A marina. On my lake. I closed my eyes for a long breath, trying to steady the heat climbing up my spine. Uncle Ray had spent his whole life protecting this lake. He taught me how runoff flowed through its limestone bed, how the water level could rise 2 inches after a single night of hard rain, how the trout followed the shadows near the western shelf in summer. He loved this place with a stubbornness that bordered on holy. And now someone had poured concrete right where he used to push his old wooden boat into the water. A breeze rolled across the lake, scattering ripples toward me. For a moment, The ranch almost felt like itself again. The distant call of a hawk, the whispering rush of pines behind me. Then I looked back at the mansion, and the feeling vanished. I walked farther down the path until I reached the new gate. Not a ranch gate. Those are rough timber, carved by weather and work. This one was polished steel framed by stacked stone columns. It had a keypad, security cameras, and a freshly graveled pullout beside it. Right in the center of the gate hung a laminated notice in bold print. Access restricted Lake Ridge Estates, HOA trespassers will be prosecuted. My hands curled into fists before I realized it. Trespassers. On land that had been in my family for nearly a century. I stepped closer, the wind brushing against the paper. It was pristine, not weather-worn. New. Someone had planted this sign with perfect confidence, as if they truly believed they had the authority to shut me out. I tried the latch, not to enter, but to test the build. Solid, heavy, professionally installed. Whoever did this wasn't guessing. They weren't mistaken. They weren't uncertain. They were certain enough to stake a claim. On my soil, my shoreline, my lake. I looked at the mansion again. Sunlight hit one of the windows, flaring like a burn in my vision. For the first time since driving onto the property, the shock turned into something heavier, more settled, a kind of sinking certainty. Someone had crossed the line, and they crossed it boldly. The wind shifted, carrying the faint smell of concrete dust across the water. The same direction where the excavators must have dug, where graders smoothed the road, where trucks hauled materials day and night. None of it should have happened. Not without permits from the real landowner. Not without my signature. But clearly, someone had given them permission, or someone had forged something close enough to look legal. I exhaled slowly, trying to steady the churn in my chest. The sun climbed higher, catching on the lake and breaking into small, dancing shards of white. It should have been beautiful. It used to be. But the weight of what stood across the water smothered everything. The quiet, the history, the way the land used to breathe on its own. I glanced back at the new sign one more time. HOA managed. An HOA. Here. On a ranch that had never, not once, belonged to anyone but the Cole family. My heartbeat thudded in my ears. I moved closer to the gate, reading the lettering again, forcing myself to look at it until the disbelief burned off and only resolve remained. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't a simple dispute. Someone had taken something that didn't belong to them, and the mansion standing on my shoreline was their loudest confession. The breeze lifted the corners of the laminated notice, tapping it lightly against the metal bar. Who gave them permission to build any of this? I stared through the gate at the road leading deeper into the so-called community, then back at the mansion dominating the shore. Whoever it was, they were about to learn exactly whose land they were standing on. A gust of cold Wyoming air swept down from the ridgeline, carrying dust that stung my eyes. I brushed it off my sleeve and took a cautious step toward the gate. Steel bars, smooth and thick, caught the late morning light in a way that felt almost smug. There were cameras mounted above, their lenses glinting like they were waiting for me to make a wrong move. I didn't touch the keypad. I only leaned in close enough to study the make. Top of the line, weather-sealed, wired deep underground. Someone had spent real money on this. The kind of money you only spend when you believe the ground beneath it is yours. Behind the gate, I heard footsteps, quick, crisp, and purposeful. A shadow moved inside the guard booth. Then a uniformed man stepped out, hand resting on his hip like he'd practiced the motion in a mirror. He wasn't sheriff's department, not even county security. HOA security, blue polo, badge-shaped logo, radio clipped to a belt that looked too new. "Sir," he called, voice firm but not hostile. This is private HOA property. Can I help you with something? I felt the tension gather between my shoulders. Yeah, I said, keeping my tone calm. You can help me by telling me who built that mansion on my lake. His brow furrowed in polite confusion, the kind people use when they think you're mistaken, and they're being generous enough to pretend otherwise. Sir, Lake Ridge Estates is private property owned by the HOA and its residents. If you're interested in touring the development, you'll need to schedule an appointment with management. His voice softened slightly. But you can't be standing here. This is restricted access. I almost laughed. It wasn't anger yet, just sheer disbelief rising like heat off the ground. Restricted? I asked. I own this lake, this ranch, this shoreline. My family's deed goes back almost 100 years. The guard shifted, not aggressively, more like he was preparing for a difficult customer. Sir, I'll ask you once more to leave. If you don't, I'll have to call the HOA president. Good, I said. Do that. He hesitated, then lifted his radio. A moment later, a black SUV rolled up behind the gate. Polished paint, chrome trim, tires too clean for ranch country. The gate slid open with a hydraulic hum, just wide enough for the SUV to glide through, and then she stepped out. Bethany Reed, mid-50s, tailored navy blazer despite the dust, blonde hair tied back in a tight knot that didn't move even when the wind pushed at it. She looked at me like she'd been expecting someone important, but got me instead. Can I help you? She asked, each word crisp as snapped twigs. Yeah, I said, leveling my gaze at her. You can tell me why you built a mansion on my land. Her smile was automatic, polished, practiced. I think you're confused. This land belongs to the Lake Ridge Estates HOA, not to whoever you are. Name's Remy Cole, I said. My family's owned this ranch since 1932. That lake belongs to me. That shoreline belongs to me. And that mansion is sitting exactly where my uncle's fishing trail used to be. Bethany's smile thinned, but she didn't break. Mr. Cole, the HOA purchased this parcel several years ago through county-approved processes. We have full survey documentation and permits to prove it. If you believe there's some misunderstanding, you're welcome to contact our legal department. You built a development on my land, I repeated, letting the wind carry the words between us. There is no misunderstanding. For a moment, something flickered in her eyes. Not fear, not guilt, but irritation. The kind people feel when you inconvenience their day. Sir, she said, slipping into a tone meant to sound patient but dripping condescension. I understand that old ranch properties often have confusing boundaries. But our survey is current, modern, legal. If your documents are outdated, that's a matter you should resolve privately. This community cannot be disrupted by unfounded claims. Unfounded. She said it so casually it almost didn't land. But then it did, hard and clean. My deed is not outdated, I said slowly. My uncle kept our records meticulously. Water rights, boundary surveys, everything. Nothing has changed. Her smile brightened, not friendly, but victorious. Well, she said, it has now. Behind her, the guard straightened. The mansion glimmered in the sun, like it was listening to every word. Bethany continued, This area is no longer part of your ranch. The HOA ensured the lake and surrounding land were properly integrated into community property years ago. We've improved access, built amenities, and created value. You're welcome to join the community, of course, but you cannot simply wander onto private land and claim ownership. Heat prickled across my back. Bethany, I didn't wander onto anything. I drove onto the ranch my family owns. I have never sold an acre of it. She lifted one eyebrow, studying me like she was deciding whether I was a threat or an inconvenience. Mr. Cole, she said softly, trespassing is a serious matter. I don't want to escalate this, so I'm giving you one final warning. Leave this property immediately. I stared at her for a long moment. The wind carried the scent of lake water and pine between us. I could hear distant hammering from somewhere behind the mansion, construction still in full swing. This woman truly believed she had the right to order me off my own land. Not just believed it, expected it. I looked at the gate, then the sign, then back at her. You've built on the wrong side of the line, I murmured. Bethany crossed her arms, posture stiff. The only lines that matter, she said, are the ones recognized by the HOA. Then she nodded at the guard. Escort him out. He stepped toward me, careful, not aggressive. This wasn't his fight, and he knew it. But he was doing his job. I took a step back, not because they told me to, but because I suddenly understood something important. They weren't hiding what they'd done. They weren't unsure. They weren't nervous. They thought they were untouchable. I turned toward my truck while Bethany watched like a hawk perched on a branch, confident the world below belonged to her. Over my shoulder, I said, You'll want to keep your schedule open, Bethany. You're about to have a very busy few weeks. Her voice followed me, hard as winter. Mr. Cole, if you return here again without permission, we will involve law enforcement. I paused, one hand on the truck door. Good, I said quietly. Make sure you do. Her confusion lasted only a second before she regained her polished calm. I climbed into the truck, the engine rumbling beneath me like an old friend waking up. As I pulled away, I glanced in the mirror. Bethany was still there at the gate, arms folded, the mansion rising behind her like a trophy she'd already claimed. But the thing about trophies is simple. You only get to keep them if they were yours to begin with. And that mansion wasn't. Not by law, not by deed, not by any stretch of truth. She just didn't know yet what I had in that old ranch house waiting for me. The documents, the history, and the evidence that would unravel everything she thought she controlled. And she would. Soon. The road back to the main house cut through a narrow stretch of pines, their needles whispering above me like they were sharing secrets in a language older than the state itself. The sun filtered through the branches, breaking into scattered patches of gold on the hood of my truck. Every bend I turned felt sharper than I remembered, as if the land itself tensed under the weight of what I'd just seen. By the time the ranch house came into view, my heart had steadied, but my jaw was still tight. The place stood exactly as it always had. Weathered logs darkened by decades of wind and sun, a stone chimney leaning just slightly to one side, the old porch sagging at the corner. Uncle Ray never managed to get around to fixing. It looked tired but familiar, like a loyal dog waiting on a step. I parked beside the leaning fence that kept the cattle from wandering into the yard. Dust trailed off behind me and settled in the quiet. The silence felt different here, thicker, heavier, like the house already knew why I'd come back. Inside, the air smelled faintly of cedar, old books, and the lingering hint of my uncle's pipe tobacco, the scent that always meant home to me. Dust motes drifted through the light streaming in from the small window over the sink. Nothing had changed. His boots still sat by the door, the wool jacket he wore every winter still hung on the peg, and the old kettle still rested on the stovetop. I shut the door behind me and stood there a moment, letting the house settle around me, letting the weight of the day find its place. Then I went to the bedroom. The safe was tucked inside the closet, half hidden behind boxes of winter blankets. The metal had dulled over the years, but the combination lock was still smooth under my fingers. My uncle had drilled the code into me when I was 16. Land don't protect itself, Remy, he'd said, and paper is as sharp as barbed wire if you know how to use it. Back then, I didn't understand what he meant, Today, I understood exactly. I spun the dial, listening for the small clicks that matched the numbers burned into my memory. The lock gave a soft, metallic groan and swung open. Inside were the things he told me to guard with my life. The original deed, creased at the folds, yellowed at the edges, but still crisp enough to read the ink. I lifted it carefully, the thick paper cool between my fingers. My grandfather's name was still bold across the title. Cole Family Ranch, 900 acres, including associated lake and waterways. Beside it were rolled survey maps from the 1950s, boundary descriptions typed by state clerks who probably never left their desks, old mineral rights claims, water usage logs for the dam upstream, and a folder thick with correspondence dating back to the 1970s. My uncle's handwriting was everywhere. Notes in the margins, small arrows pointing to landmarks, dates and signatures from every official he'd dealt with. This wasn't disorganized nostalgia. This was a lifetime of protection. I spread the documents across the bed, the mattress sagging slightly under the weight of history. As I read, the shape of the land unfolded through his notes, the natural boundaries, the ridges he fought to keep undeveloped, the agreements with neighboring ranchers, the water easement for the dam that ensured the lake stayed ours. But then, tucked behind the older papers, I found something newer. A survey stamped less than 2 years ago, not from a company I recognized, not ordered by Uncle Ray. My chest tightened. This new survey had a clean layout, modern GPS coordinates, and, most importantly, a subtle but unmistakable shift in the eastern property line. Not much on paper, but enough. Enough to carve out shoreline. Enough to justify the mansion. Enough to let an HOA pretend the land was theirs. I held the newer survey up to the original. The difference wasn't subtle anymore. Not when held side by side. The modern lines cut into the family boundary like a scalpel, slicing off about 15 acres of prime lakefront and pushing it into what they labeled as Community Parcel B. My throat tightened. Uncle Ray hadn't signed anything. There were no documents showing a sale, no recorded transfer, no correspondence implying consent. The new survey had simply appeared, stamped by the county recorder's office, probably slipped in under the guise of routine updates. A cold, steady anger spread in my chest, different from the heat I'd felt earlier. This wasn't outrage. This wasn't disbelief. This was calculation. The kind of cold clarity you get when someone tries to take something precious and thinks you won't notice. I dug deeper into the safe. More letters. Most addressed to my uncle from various county offices. At first, routine filings, tax notices, agricultural forms, water reports. Then, a year and a half ago, a letter stamped Survey Department requesting confirmation of boundary markers on the eastern edge. A follow-up sent a month later after receiving no response. Then another notice marked urgent. And finally, an envelope returned to sender. Unopened. Addressed to my uncle. Postmarked 2 months before he died. I sank onto the edge of the bed. The letters spread around me like fallen leaves. Uncle Ray had been sick then. Heart issues, failing eyesight. He wouldn't have ignored these intentionally. He would have fought back if he'd known what they were trying to do. He'd told me to protect the land because he feared exactly this. I closed my eyes and let the weight of that responsibility settle on my shoulders. Outside, the wind rattled the windows, the sound distant yet grounding. Somewhere far down the slope, the lake shimmered, unaware of the battle forming around it. When I opened my eyes, the sun had shifted, casting long shadows across the papers. And in that light, the path forward seemed painfully clear. Someone had redrawn my family's boundaries. Someone had pushed papers through the county as if the owner no longer mattered. Someone had taken advantage of an old man's silence. And now they were parading around in a mansion built on the theft. I gathered every document into a stack. Deed, original surveys, water rights, the outdated but correct boundary maps, and that fraudulent survey I'd never seen until today. As I placed them back into the safe, only temporarily, I caught my reflection in the old mirror hanging on the wall, dust on my jeans, lines of tension around my eyes, a man who looked like he'd been away too long. I whispered to the empty room, "I'm home now, Uncle Ray." Then I closed the safe, spun the dial until it locked, and stood. Bethany Reed thought the land was hers. She thought a stamped survey was enough to rewrite history. She thought a gate and a threat could scare off a rancher. She hadn't counted on the documents in this safe, or the man who now carried them. She would learn soon enough. The late afternoon sun was already drifting toward the western ridge when I stepped back outside, the folder of copied documents tucked under my arm. The air had cooled, that crisp Wyoming kind of cool that smells like dust, pine, and meltwater rolling down from the higher peaks. I paused on the porch and took in the silence. Deep, steady, familiar. It should have comforted me. Instead, it felt like the land was holding its breath. I locked the door behind me and headed down toward the lake. There was no reason to delay. I needed to see the boundary myself, the real one, not the fiction someone had stamped and filed without my knowledge. The original markers were stone slabs set by my grandfather with a county surveyor in 1952, solid things buried knee-deep and braced against decades of weather. They'd held through storms, floods, droughts. They wouldn't have moved on their own. If they no longer lined up, someone had moved the truth. A narrow game trail wound down from the ridge into the eastern meadow. The grass brushed against my jeans as I pushed through, dry stalks whispering like they were warning me I wouldn't like what I found. I passed through a patch of aspen, white bark catching the sunlight in silver flashes, and stepped onto ground that sloped gently toward the lake. From here, the mansion was visible through the trees, its glass walls throwing back the sky in bright, blinding shards. I could hear distant machinery, a generator, maybe a concrete mixer, humming faintly like a mosquito that wouldn't leave you alone. But that wasn't what I came down here for. The first original marker should have been close. I slowed my pace, moving carefully along the rise, scanning the earth for the familiar shape. My uncle had shown it to me 100 times growing up. "These stones," he'd say, patting the rough granite edge, "are the backbone of everything we protect." It took a few minutes, but I finally spotted it, a chunk of weathered stone half buried near the base of an old pine. Moss had crept along its edges, and needles blanketed the soil around it. But the iron rod driven through its center was unmistakable. I knelt beside it and brushed away debris. There it was, exactly where it had been for 70 years. I marked the coordinate on my handheld GPS. Dead on. But the new survey, the fake one, claimed the boundary had been shifted more than 300 feet west of this point. If that were true, I'd be standing on HOA land right now. I snorted. Not a chance. I rose and moved east, stepping through tall grass, using the GPS to guide me toward the position where the fraudulent marker shouldn't be. It didn't take long to find it. Bright orange plastic stood out like a slap of spray paint against the natural colors of the field. The stake was thin, flimsy, with a metallic tag stamped with the name of a surveying company I didn't recognize. Frontier Geo Solutions, Denver, CO. The date on the tag made my stomach tighten. Barely a year old. I crouched beside it. No moss, no weathering, not even a lean. It had been placed recently, and poorly. Someone who thought no one would check, or who didn't care if they did. I tugged gently. The stake wobbled in loose soil. A real marker is driven deep, anchored, aligned precisely with reference points, solid enough to outlive the person who installed it. This thing could have been planted by anyone with a mallet and a map drawn by a liar. I checked the GPS. This marker was far west of where it should have been. Not meters, hundreds of feet. That shift alone gave the HOA exactly the slice of lakefront they'd claimed. It wasn't sloppy. It wasn't an accident. It was deliberate. The breeze kicked up, dragging waves of dry grass across the field in shimmering ripples. The mansion's glass caught the light again, a flash like a signal mirror from a distant camp. For a second, the reflection stung my eyes, and I turned away. I moved on, checking where the next marker should have been. And sure enough, I found another fake stake, almost identical, driven into the dirt at a position that made my stomach twist harder. 3 more steps. 3 more newly placed lies. When I finally found the second original marker, another weathered stone slab, half swallowed by time, it was nowhere near the plastic stake that supposedly replaced it. I wiped the dirt from its surface with the edge of my sleeve. The iron rod was still solid. The stone unmoved. GPS confirmed it. The original line hadn't shifted an inch in 70 years. My family's land was still where it had always been. It was the HOA, the builder, or whoever ordered the fraudulent survey, who'd moved the lines on paper and hoped nobody would notice the truth written in stone. I straightened, the folder of documents tucked under my arm, my hand still dusted from old granite and new plastic. The contrast felt symbolic, one built to last a lifetime, the other to survive long enough to fool a county clerk. Far down the meadow, engines rumbled, heavy machinery, probably laying more sidewalk or driving posts for a fence that didn't belong here. The noise rose and fell like distant thunder, completely out of place in the serenity that used to define this land. My uncle had once said the lake was a living thing, and that if you listened closely, you could hear when it was unsettled. Standing there with the breeze shifting and the hum of machines cutting into the quiet, I felt that truth deep in my bones. They'd dug into soil that wasn't theirs. They'd poured concrete into a shoreline they didn't own. They'd redrawn a map that had no business being touched. Somewhere behind a wall of glass and steel, Bethany Reed and her board sat comfortably, believing paperwork was enough to erase a century of ownership. But documents didn't build this ranch. Stone did. Sweat did. My grandfather did. My uncle did. And now it was on me. I walked to the edge of the lake where the water shimmered soft and blue. I crouched down, dipping my fingers into the cold surface. The reflection of the mansion rippled outward in broken, shifting lines, exactly how their case would soon look. A hawk cried from the ridge, its voice sharp and echoing across the valley. The sound followed me as I rose and turned back toward the ranch house. The wind carried the scent of dust and pine again, mingling with something new. The scent of freshly cut lumber drifting from the direction of the HOA construction zone. It fueled me. I'd seen what I needed to see. Original markers standing where they always had. Fake ones planted by eager hands with guilty intentions. A boundary moved on paper, not earth. And a mansion sitting like a crown atop stolen land. As I walked back up the trail, the folder hugged tight to my chest. A single thought settled into me. Quiet, steady, immovable. They thought this land was theirs. But the truth was older, stronger, and carved into the very ground they built on. And the truth was about to surface. By the time I reached the ranch house again, a heavy stillness had settled over the valley. Twilight in Wyoming has a way of making everything feel sharper. The shadows longer, the air thinner, the sounds clearer. I stood on the porch for a moment, the wooden boards creaking under my weight as the fading light washed the sky in dusty gold. Inside the house, the quiet felt deeper than before. It wasn't emptiness. It was focus. The kind that comes right before you decide what to do next. I spread the documents out across the kitchen table. Just the copies this time. The originals stayed locked in the safe. Deeds, water rights, boundary maps that went back generations. And that fraudulent survey, the one someone hoped no one would ever compare to the real thing. A cold certainty settled in my chest. If the HOA believed I'd storm through their gates with anger and noise, they didn't know me at all. Noise gets you nowhere in a place like this. Silence gets you everything. I reached for my phone, plugged into the wall by the window. There was only one person I trusted with land this complicated. Sarah Mitchell answered on the second ring. Her voice, steady, seasoned, familiar, filled the room. "Remy? You back in Wyoming?" "Yeah," I said, "and I found something you need to see." She exhaled, a slow, controlled breath. "You sound like you're about to ask me to cancel my weekend. You weren't doing anything fun anyway." She let out a low laugh, dry but warm. "Send me photos." I angled each document under the lamp, making sure the shadows didn't distort the ink. First the deed, then the dam permit, then the original boundary map, then the fraudulent survey. They looked like distant cousins who didn't want to admit they shared a bloodline. "What am I looking at?" she asked after a few seconds of silence. "Someone moved the eastern boundary line," I said. Another pause. "How much?" 300 feet. I could almost hear her straighten in her chair. "That's not an adjustment. That's a land grab. I found the fake markers today. Plastic stakes hammered into loose dirt. Nothing official. Nothing legal." "Who filed the survey?" "A company out of Denver. Frontier Geosolutions. You ever hear of them?" She hummed thoughtfully. "Small-time firm. Mostly developer contracts. And if the developer hired them..." Then we said it at the same time, the words lining up perfectly. The HOA knew. I felt the weight of it land between us. Not a surprise. More like confirmation of a suspicion we'd both been circling. Sarah went on. "Listen carefully. Don't confront them again. Don't call the county. Don't tell anyone what you found. Just keep everything quiet until I get there." That was the plan. Good. For now, do nothing. Let them keep thinking you walked away upset. People who think they've won make mistakes. I nodded, even though she couldn't see it. The silence around me deepened, settling into something dense and useful. "I'll drive up tomorrow," she said. "Early." "You sure?" "I handled land disputes for 30 years, she said. "But I've never been more sure than I am right now. Whoever pushed that survey through is counting on you being passive. Let's make them wish they hadn't." When we hung up, the ranch house felt a little less empty. I gathered the documents into a neat stack, the edges crisp under my fingertips. Sarah was right. Noise only warned them. Silence made them confident. And confident people overlooked things that mattered, like the quiet hum of a drone. I heard it faintly at first, just a soft, mechanical whir blending with the night breeze. My head snapped toward the window. Through the fading light, just beyond the tree line, a small dark shape drifted along the horizon, moving slowly, deliberately. A drone. Not mine, not county. Someone else's. I stepped onto the porch, careful not to make the boards creak too loudly. The drone hovered for a moment, then tilted slightly, its camera angled toward the ranch house. Its red light blinked, steady, searching. I felt a cold ripple along the back of my neck. They were watching, recording, trying to see what I would do next. They expected anger. They expected confrontation. They expected mistakes. Instead, I stepped back into the shadows beneath the porch roof and let the drone pass. It drifted away after a minute, disappearing over the ridge toward the mansion. I waited until the hum faded completely before returning inside. Silence wasn't a retreat. It was positioning. I cleared the table, locked every document back in the safe, then sat for a long while in the dim kitchen, listening to the wind slip between the eaves and the frogs start their nightly chorus on the far side of the lake. somewhere in that darkness, the HOA sat in their glass-walled palace believing they were untouchable, believing their survey was airtight, believing the boundaries they invented would hold. They didn't know the land like I did. They didn't know the history they'd tried to rewrite. They didn't know the lawyer who would be standing in my doorway at sunrise. And they certainly didn't know the man who could outwait a storm, outlisten a lie, and outprove any piece of paper they dared to forge. So I sat in the quiet, not hiding, not afraid, preparing. The night deepened. The air cooled. The land steadied itself, and so did I. By dawn, a thin layer of frost had settled across the ranch yard, turning the dry grass brittle and pale. When I stepped outside, the ground crackled under my boots, the cold crisp enough to sting my lungs in that clean Wyoming way. The horizon glowed faintly, soft peach bleeding into the lingering blue of night. Sarah arrived just after sunrise. I heard her truck long before I saw it, the familiar rumble of an old diesel engine that had followed her into more land disputes than either of us could count. When she pulled up next to my porch, dust drifted around the tires like steam rising from bathwater. Sarah stepped out, wrapped in a warm canvas jacket, her dark hair pulled back, her eyes sharp even through the morning chill. "You look like you haven't slept," she said. I didn't. That's usually a sign the other side made a mistake. She shut her door, surveying the ridgeline and the lake below, with the practiced eyes of someone who'd built a career telling truth from lies by reading the land itself. "Show me." I led her inside. She didn't bother taking off her boots. She'd been in enough ranch houses to know no one minded. The kitchen table was cleared, the lamp already on. I laid out the documents like cards in a winning hand. Deed, original survey, dam permit, water rights, boundary descriptions, and the fraudulent survey. Sarah put on her glasses, bending over each page, her fingers gliding across the papers like she was feeling for hidden seams. She nodded slowly. "This is clean. Too clean." I frowned. "What do you mean?" She tapped the fraudulent survey. People who forge land documents usually make little mistakes, spacing errors, inconsistent line weights, mismatched bearings. But this was drafted professionally. Someone paid good money for this to look legitimate. "Developers?" I asked. "Maybe, but a regular developer wouldn't risk something this sloppy. No, Remy. Someone thinks they're untouchable." She paused. "Or someone believes the county won't challenge them." I didn't have to say who. We both knew. We walked outside, the cold air biting at our faces as we headed toward the ridge overlooking the lake. From up here, the mansion sat like an invader, its reflective windows shining in the morning sun, the concrete path curving down toward the water like a scar. But something else caught our eye. Construction crews were already working. Dozens of workers in reflective vests moved across the site like ants on a mound. Trucks with fresh stacks of lumber and rebar rolled in through the gate. The sound of power saws echoed across the valley. A cement truck backed toward a frame that looked like the start of a second building, smaller than the mansion, but too close to the shoreline to be legal. "Unbelievable," Sarah muttered. "They didn't waste time." "They're accelerating," she said. "Someone told them to build fast, faster than they can be stopped." Concrete splashed into wooden forms as the mixer turned, releasing puffs of gray dust into the breeze. Another crew laid stone along the walkway, shaping a decorative path leading toward a private dock. A crane rotated slowly, lowering steel beams into place beside the mansion. Every hour they built, they made the lie harder to unwind. Sarah crossed her arms, staring hard at the development. "They're trying to establish presence. The more they build, the more they'll argue it's too late to undo." "It's not too late," I said. "No." Her voice sharpened. "But if they pour a foundation on disputed land, They'll try to claim you're interfering with an established community. Courts will hate the mess. She pulled out her phone and began snapping photos. Wide shots, time-stamped, showing exactly how far the construction was encroaching on my shoreline. As she documented everything, I noticed something further down the dirt path. A pallet of metal stakes lying beside a bundle of neon orange flags. More fake markers, waiting to be planted across my land. My jaw clenched. They're planning to shift even more of the boundary. Sarah followed my gaze. Then we can't give them silence for long, just long enough to gather more evidence. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of fresh concrete and chainsaw exhaust across the lake. It mixed with the mountain air in a way that made my stomach twist, like the land itself recoiled at what was happening. "I'm going down there," I said. "Not today," Sarah replied quickly. "You step foot on that construction site, and Bethany will call the sheriff before your boots hit the ground. Right now, you have the advantage. They think you're alone, unprepared, and outmatched. Let them keep thinking that while we build the case." I didn't like it, but she was right. We walked back toward the truck, the crunch of frost beneath our boots sharp in the quiet morning. The sun had risen higher now, illuminating every angle of the mansion, like a spotlight on a stage set for a play I never agreed to perform in. Sarah leaned against her truck, pulling out a notebook and jotting down details. Time of day, construction activity, approximate encroachment distance. Her breath fogged with each exhale. "You said your uncle got a notice from the county?" she asked. "Yeah, more than one. We'll need those, and anything else the county sent him in the last 5 years. They're in the safe." "Good. Bring them out later. We'll cross-check names and dates against county planning records." She closed her notebook, her jaw tightening. "But right now, we watch." "Watch?" She nodded toward the gate. A black SUV rolled through, slowing as it passed the mansion. The same model Bethany had driven. It parked beside the house and she stepped out, clipboard in hand, talking confidently to the foreman while pointing toward the lake like she was queen of a kingdom. "Look at her," Sarah whispered. "She's inspecting like she owns the world. She's building faster than the law." "Exactly." Sarah's gaze hardened. "Let her. Every hour she builds gives us more evidence of willful encroachment." Bethany turned suddenly, scanning the ridge with narrowed eyes. I stepped back behind a tree as her gaze traced the horizon. Even from this distance, I could see her jaw tense, as if she sensed something was out of place. But she didn't know what. Not yet. The workers returned to their saws and drills, drowning the morning in mechanical noise. Sarah climbed into her truck. "I'll be at the county office all afternoon. I need to check who approved that survey and what else they pushed through. You stay quiet. Let them build. Let them reveal their hand. What should I do in the meantime?" "Document everything. Every truck, every worker, every new structure. And don't let them catch you doing it." She started the engine, gravel scattering beneath her tires. As she drove away, the ranch fell quiet again, the hum of construction drifting faintly on the air. I stood alone on the ridge, watching the mansion rise higher, the dock lengthen, the concrete harden into stolen permanence. They were building fast, faster than the law. But the land remembered the truth, and soon so would everyone else. By midday the following morning, the valley was alive with noise. The buzz of saws, the grind of concrete mixers, the beeping of reversing trucks, sounds that had no place on the quiet banks of my lake, echoed off the water like they were mocking the stillness that used to define this land. Every vibration rattled the windows of my ranch house, as if the construction crews were hammering directly into my bones. I sat at the table, with a fresh pot of coffee cooling beside me, flipping through the photocopied documents again and again, not because I needed to, but because repetition steadied my thoughts. Outside, the shadows were growing sharper as the sun climbed higher, casting long, straight lines across the dirt yard and illuminating the dust kicked up from the trucks driving in and out of the HOA gate. A truck engine rumbled up the driveway. I recognized it before it stopped. Sarah stepped out, closing the door with her boot. She didn't say anything at first. She just handed me a folder, thicker than the one I'd shown her yesterday. "You might want to sit down," she said. That alone sent a cold ripple through me. I pulled out a chair, the legs scraping against the old wooden floor. Sarah laid the folder down, opened it, and spread the papers out neatly. "You were right about the fraudulent survey," she said. "But you weren't right about who pushed it through." I frowned. "I figured it was the developer." "Oh, he's involved," she said. "Very involved. But he's not the one with the most to lose." She tapped a page with her finger. "Take a look at the signature." I leaned forward. The survey firm's stamp was crisp and official. Frontier Geosolutions, Denver, Colorado. The signature beneath it was clean, looping, confident. Signed, J. Mercer. I stared at it for a long moment, waiting for the realization to fully settle. When it did, it hit like a weight dropped straight into my chest. "Jake Mercer," I said. "The developer?" "Not just the developer," Sarah replied softly. "The county records list this particular surveyor as a licensed consultant, hired for several recent developments across the state. He's been the go-to name for boundary adjustments that conveniently favor new construction." My pulse quickened. "So, he redrew my boundary line? He drafted it, signed it, and submitted it, and the county recorder pushed it through in a single day, signed by someone who normally takes weeks to process these things." I clenched my jaw. "Who?" Sarah slid another page forward. "A clerk named Andrea Mercer." I blinked. "Mercer again?" She nodded. "Sister." A heat rose in my chest. Not the explosive kind, but the kind that tightens slowly until your breath feels too shallow. "And you said the surveyor was Jake's," I started. "Brother," she confirmed. "The developer's younger brother. The man building your shoreline hired his own brother to redraw the boundaries, then had his sister approve it." I sat back, the chair groaning under my weight. A family operation. "A family operation using an HOA as a shield," Sarah said. "Bethany is the public face, but the Mercers? They're the engine behind this." I stared out the window. Across the valley, I could see the mansion rising higher. Workers were framing a second-story deck with thick beams, each thud of their hammers echoing down into the valley. Another crew was assembling the dock, driving metal spikes deep into the lakebed. I felt the land recoil. I felt my uncle's voice in the past, warning me about people who saw nature as profit instead of heritage. And I felt the anger rising, not hot and chaotic, but cold and deliberate. Sarah slid one more sheet toward me, an email printout she'd somehow obtained from county archives. "Read this," she said. The email was short, but not short enough to hide its intent. "Project must move quickly. Boundary has been updated. Owner of adjacent parcel is uninvolved, out of the picture. Make sure HOA president handles public side. Need full groundwork completed before anyone challenges. J.M." My breath slowed. "They thought my uncle was out of the picture," I said quietly. "He was old, sick, and not responding to letters," Sarah said. "To them, that meant opportunity. They didn't think I'd come back." "No," she said, "they didn't." My eyes drifted again toward the lake. A crane swung a steel beam into place, its long arm passing like a shadow across the water. The noise seemed louder now, more intrusive, as if the land itself was calling for me to act. But the law was still our weapon. Not anger, not confrontation. "What's our next step?" I asked. "First," Sarah said, "we gather evidence of willful coordination. Not just mistakes, intent. County records, Developer communications, construction logs, anything that shows this wasn't an accident, but a deliberate scheme. I nodded slowly. And second, she continued, we don't let them realize how much we know. Not yet. Silence settled between us, the solid, purposeful kind. Outside, wind brushed through the pines and sent a ripple across the lake's surface. It caught the reflection of the mansion and twisted it into a distorted, broken shape. There's more, Sarah added quietly. I looked back at her. She held up a photo, a scanned copy of a permit application from 2 years ago. It listed proposed construction on the eastern lakeshore. Under the line marked property owner, the name filled me with a cold, steady fury. Lake Ridge Estates HOA representative, Bethany Reed. She claimed ownership long before the mansion existed, Sarah said. Before the fraudulent survey, before the county clerk pushed anything through. They didn't steal the land when they built. They stole it on paper long before a shovel ever hit dirt. The room felt smaller suddenly, tighter. The walls seemed to lean in with the weight of what we'd uncovered. They forged a future, I murmured. They forged a future, she agreed, and then built a mansion on top of it. A sharp, metallic clang echoed from across the valley, steel hitting steel, and the sound rolled across the lake like a warning bell. I rose from the table, walked to the window, and watched the workers swarm around the mansion like bees around a hive. They were building faster now, as if driven by urgency or fear of being stopped. They knew what they signed, I said quietly. They knew exactly what they were taking. And now, Sarah replied, standing beside me, they're about to learn exactly who they took it from. Wind rattled the porch boards as the house seemed to draw in a breath with me. The truth had surfaced, and it had the wrong last name. By sunrise the next morning, the whole valley felt different. Not quieter, not with the HOA crews grinding machinery through the dawn, but heavier, like the land itself knew something was about to shift. The lake was glass still, holding the first pink streaks of morning, and every sound echoed as if the mountains were leaning in to listen. I had barely finished tightening the laces on my boots when a dust cloud rose along the old ranch road. 2 vehicles. The first was a dark county SUV. The second, a truck I recognized instantly, belonged to the state's water resources inspector. Sarah stepped out before the engines even cooled, her coat whipping behind her in the wind. She looked like she hadn't slept, and I didn't blame her. After what we uncovered about the Mercer siblings, she'd filed a formal complaint with the county and state, and someone had actually taken it seriously. The sheriff emerged next. Sheriff Marcus Hale, broad-shouldered, worn-in boots and a face carved by decades of Western weather. He approached slowly, eyes scanning the ranch house, the lake, the mansion glinting on stolen ground. "Morning, Remy," he said. "We got your complaint. Seems we've got some things to look into." The water inspector, a tall woman named Lillian Cruz, nodded respectfully. "Morning, Mr. Cole. I'm here specifically regarding water rights and structural changes to the shoreline." She didn't say it loudly, but it landed with enough force to send a shiver through me. Water rights. The one thing the Mercers couldn't fake. Not with signatures, not with surveys, not with relatives in the county recorder's office. "Let's walk," Sarah said, stepping beside me. We led them down the old footpath to the lake, boots crunching through frost-tipped grass. The air smelled like wet pine and cold stone. Birds fluttered across the water, disturbed by the machinery grinding away across the shore. And then the sheriff saw it. The mansion jutting over the lake with steel beams, the construction crews, the heavy equipment lined up like an invading army. His jaw set hard. "What exactly am I looking at?" he asked. "A private HOA," I said, "or so they claim." Sheriff Hale let out a quiet huff. "Funny. I've never seen an HOA with a marina under construction on land they don't own." Lillian pulled a clipboard from her bag, flipping through pages until she found what she needed. "Before we go any further," she said, "I need to know who holds the senior rights to this water source, including the headgate, shoreline, and upstream flow control. Without that, none of this construction can legally continue." I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. I lifted the old deed and the water rights documentation from my backpack, the same papers my uncle had kept guarded for decades, and placed them on the hood of the sheriff's SUV. The wind lifted the corner of the parchment, revealing the date. 1956. Older than the Mercer siblings, older than Bethany's HOA, older than the county boundary lines in their current form. Lillian's eyes widened. She traced the signature at the bottom, my grandfather's, and the official stamp from the State Water Commission. "Remy," she murmured, "these are senior rights, priority rights. These override any modern development permit." Sheriff Hale leaned closer, his brows knitting. "And Bethany didn't mention any of this." "No," I said evenly. "She told me I was trespassing." The sheriff looked out toward the noise across the lake. "Well," he said, rubbing his chin, "that's going to be a problem for her." We walked farther down the trail until the path opened into a clearing directly opposite the mansion. Crews were already working on the new marina, driving metal supports straight into the lake bed, sending ripples across the surface. Every strike of the hydraulic hammer felt like an insult. Lillian raised a pair of binoculars, her jaw tightening. "That is an unpermitted shoreline alteration," she said. "And that," she pointed at a concrete pad being poured, "violates state wetland protection guidelines." Sarah exhaled slowly, her breath white in the cold. "They knew," she said. "They knew exactly what they were doing." Sheriff Hale motioned to a deputy to start taking photos. "Let's get Bethany out here. She's got some questions to answer." He radioed a request, and 15 minutes later, through the dust of the newly paved road, the HOA's black SUV rolled toward us. It pulled up, polished and pristine, out of place against the rugged ranch land. Bethany stepped out with her usual veneer of confidence. Hair perfect, blazer crisp, smile thin and practiced. The sheriff didn't approach her. He just crossed his arms. "Mrs. Reed," he said, "you mind telling me who authorized this development?" Bethany didn't blink. "The HOA board," she said. "And the county. We have full rights to this community." "Do you?" Lillian asked, stepping forward. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you've altered a protected shoreline without obtaining permission from the state." Bethany's smile faltered. "We have the necessary permits." "Do you have the water rights?" Lillian asked. Bethany hesitated. That was all it took. I didn't step forward dramatically or wave papers in her face. I simply lifted the deed again, this time holding it steady so the morning light washed across the faded ink. "This land," I said calmly, "and this water belong to me." For the first time since I'd met her, Bethany Reed's mask cracked. Just for a fraction of a second. Her pupils tightened. Her breath caught. Then she slammed the mask back into place. "This is a misunderstanding," she said, her tone brittle. "Our surveyor established—" "Your surveyor," Sarah cut in, "is the brother of your developer, and the county clerk who approved your boundary shift is their sister." The valley fell silent, not because the machine stopped, but because nobody spoke. Even the workers paused, sensing something shift in the air. The sheriff stepped closer, his boots pressing firmly into the dirt. "Mrs. Reed," he said, "I'm issuing a temporary halt on all construction until this dispute is resolved." Bethany stiffened. "You can't do that." "Oh, I can," the sheriff said, "and I just did." The inspector scribbled notes faster than I'd ever seen someone write. "And I will be issuing a stop work order for environmental violations." Bethany's voice rose, trembling at the edges. You don't understand. There's millions invested here. You can't just shut us down. That's the thing about the law, Sheriff Hale said. It doesn't care how much money you've sunk into something you didn't own. Bethany spun toward me, furious. You think this is over? She snapped. It hasn't even started, I answered quietly. The sheriff turned to me. Remy, gather everything you have. We're going to need it. As the wind lifted across the lake, it carried with it the sound of construction grinding to a full stop, metal clattering, engines powering down, voices murmuring in confusion. The land was quiet again, not peaceful, but waiting, watching, and ready for what came next. By the time the hearing date arrived, the entire valley felt like it was holding its breath. The frost on the grass outside the county courthouse shimmered under a pale Montana sun, and the air carried that sharp, metallic quiet that comes before a storm, not the kind born in clouds, but in truth finally forcing its way to the surface. Sarah and I walked up the stone steps, each one echoing under our boots. She carried a leather binder stuffed so full it barely closed. I carried something older, my grandfather's deed wrapped in a protective sleeve that felt like armor in my hands. Inside, the courtroom was already half full. HOA residents, reporters, county officials trying to look calm. A few ranchers I recognized from neighboring properties. Sitting stiffly like this, fight was their own. Maybe it was. Bethany Reed sat at the defendant's table in a navy suit that looked expensive but couldn't hide the tightness in her jaw. Her developer, Jake Mercer, sat beside her, shifting restlessly in a pair of polished boots that had never seen real dirt. Their attorneys whispered instructions that Bethany nodded at without hearing. She looked smaller than she had at the lake, like the mansion behind her wasn't there to prop her up now. Judge Harland entered, taking his seat with a level expression that revealed nothing. A gavel's sharp crack split through the murmurs. Let's begin, he said. Sarah rose first. Your Honor, she began, voice steady as the wooden beams above us. This case concerns a fraudulent survey, illegally shifted boundaries, and construction carried out on property not owned by the defendants. She laid out the timeline, not dramatizing, not embellishing, just stating facts the way the land had recorded them in stone markers and signatures older than any HOA. Then she placed the deed on the table with both hands, sliding it toward the judge. The parchment caught the morning light through the tall windows, making the ink shimmer like something alive. This, she said, is the original ownership document for the eastern shore of Silver Ridge Lake. Signed in 1956, recorded, unchallenged, never transferred, never sold. It places every inch of the disputed construction well within Mr. Cole's property. Judge Harlan studied the document for a long moment. He touched the edge of the page carefully, respectfully, like he understood what generational land meant in a place like Wyoming. Bethany's attorney rose quickly, forced smile plastered on her face. Your Honor, we believe the deed is outdated and that updated surveys reflect more accurate boundaries. The HOA relied on professional. Sarah didn't wait for the sentence to finish. Your Honor, the survey they refer to was conducted by a company owned by the developer's brother. A ripple went through the room. Judge Harland raised a brow. Is that true? Jake Mercer shifted in his seat. It's a small firm, Your Honor. And the county permit approval? Sarah continued. Signed by an official who purchased a home inside the disputed development just months later? Another ripple, louder this time. Judge Harland turned his gaze to the county attorney. Is there a conflict of interest here? The attorney cleared his throat. Your Honor, the purchase was... Judge Harland held up a hand. We'll return to that. Continue, Ms. Mitchell. Sarah nodded and pulled out the photographs. My photographs. Taken the day I'd found the bright orange plastic markers shoved into the ground like planted lies. She placed them on the projector. The images lit up across the courtroom wall. The old granite markers weathered by decades, the fake stakes positioned hundreds of feet away, the GPS data overlaying both. "Your Honor," Sarah said, "the defendants didn't rely on an incorrect survey. They created one." Bethany's attorney was on her feet immediately. "This is an outrageous accusation. It's documented," Sarah said calmly, "by satellite imagery, by state records, and by the original surveyor notes. The boundary was moved by human hands, not natural forces, not historic error." The judge leaned back, taking it all in. His silence grew heavy, like the weight of the mountains outside. Then he asked, "Mrs. Reed, did you, at any point, possess documentation showing the land had been legally transferred to your HOA?" Bethany opened her mouth, closed it, then finally shook her head. "No, Your Honor. We believed the county's updated map reflected the legitimate boundary." "Believed?" Sarah repeated quietly. Then she lifted a printed email from her binder. "Your Honor, Exhibit 14. I recognized it instantly. Jake Mercer's signature, a forwarded message, a line that made my jaw clench every time I read it. Boundary adjustment approved. Owner unlikely to contest. Judge Harland read it twice. Then he looked up at Bethany, not with anger, but with something colder. Disappointment. "I've seen enough," he said. The room stilled completely. "Construction on the disputed land is hereby ordered to cease immediately. The HOA is suspended from exercising authority over any portion of Mr. Cole's property until further review. The development permit is placed under judicial investigation, and these actions," he tapped the fraudulent survey with a pen, "will be evaluated for potential criminal referral." A sharp exhale rippled through the gallery. Bethany's shoulders sagged. Jake's face drained of color. Their attorney sank slowly into her chair. "For the first time in months, I felt my lungs fully expand," the judge continued, his voice echoing against the tall wooden panels. "Land may not have a voice, but deeds do, records do, and the law does. I expect full cooperation from all parties as we move toward a final ruling regarding the structures built on Mr. Cole's land." He struck the gavel once more. Case adjourned, for now. As people rose from their seats, murmurs filling the air again, Bethany looked at me, not with anger, not with hostility, with fear. She knew she had lost control of the story she tried to write. The legal storm had only begun, but the truth had finally been spoken out loud, under oath and under the roof of a courtroom that didn't bend for money or noise or entitlement. Outside, the wind carried the scent of pine and melting frost as Sarah and I stepped back onto the courthouse steps. She closed the binder and exhaled slowly. "We're not done," she said, "but this was the turning point." I looked out toward the distant mountains, the same ones my grandfather once walked, the same ones that watched over this lake long before any HOA existed. "Yeah," I murmured. "Now they know exactly what they built on." And for the first time since returning to the ranch, the land itself felt lighter, like it too had heard the judge's ruling and could finally breathe again. The sky that afternoon was the kind of Wyoming blue you only get after a storm. Clean, stretched wide, honest. Sarah and I drove back toward the ranch in silence, the gravel crunching under the tires. Behind us, the courthouse shrank into the distance, and with it, the weight that had been pressing on my ribs since the day I'd first seen that steel and glass mansion on the lakeshore. But a court hearing wasn't the end. It was the turning of a page, and as soon as the next chapter began, everything that had been hidden would finally have to stand in the open. When we reached the ranch, the first thing I noticed was the quiet, not the soft kind, the sharp kind, the kind that made the hair on your arms lift because even the wind seemed to be waiting. The construction noise was gone. The heavy machinery that once clawed into the shoreline now sat silent, lined up like scolded children along the new asphalt the HOA had poured. As soon as I stepped out of the truck, a convoy of county vehicles pulled up behind us. Inspectors, surveyors, 2 deputies, and trailing after them, reluctantly and tight-lipped, were Bethany Reed and developer Jake Mercer. Bethany stepped out of her SUV like a queen forced to walk without her crown. She clutched a thick folder of documents, her last armor, or maybe her last denial. Her eyes flicked across the lake, then to the judge's order printed and taped to every machine. Stop work, by court order. Jake kept his gaze down, a man already calculating losses rather than fighting to keep them. The arrogance was gone. The reality was setting in. Sheriff Hale walked toward me, his boots crunching softly through frost-brittle grass. "Judge Harland asked us to oversee compliance," he said. "We're here to make sure everything stops until a final ruling. That includes all HOA authority over this section of the lake." Bethany cut in sharply. "Sheriff, this is unnecessary. We're willing to negotiate this without—" But Lillian, the state inspector, stepped between us with a calm that hit like a hammer. "Mrs. Reed, you operated an unauthorized marina, an unpermitted shoreline construction, and an HOA on land you do not own. This order isn't optional." Bethany's mouth snapped shut. The deputies began checking equipment, photographing every inch of shoreline the HOA had altered. The water shimmered behind them, pale gold, almost trembling in the cold breeze. Sarah nudged me gently. "Look." Across the lake, I saw something I hadn't expected. Residents. Dozens of them. They'd gathered near the edge of their development, faces drawn tight with confusion, fear, and something else. Recognition. The truth had finally reached them. A man in a windbreaker walked closer, stopping a few yards from the sheriff's line. "You're Remy Cole?" he asked quietly. I nodded. He swallowed, his voice unsteady. "I didn't know. None of us did. She told us it was legitimate, that the land was abandoned, that the records were complicated." His gaze drifted toward Bethany, disappointment cutting deeper than anger. Behind him, I saw others, families, retirees, people who'd sunk their savings into homes built on stolen land. They weren't the enemy. They'd been misled. Jake stood rigidly at the water's edge, staring down at the reflection of the mansion he'd built like he feared it might collapse from his gaze alone. Sarah whispered, "They're learning, Remy. One truth at a time." The county inspector approached me with a thick envelope. "Mr. Cole, this contains the court's provisional ruling. The structures on your land must either be removed or negotiated into legal standing under your ownership. The homeowners have 30 days to decide." Bethany spun toward me, panic cracking through her voice. "Removed? You can't be serious. That mansion—" I met her eyes, and for the first time, she understood that the foundation of her power, her entitlement, her certainty, her belief that the world belonged to people who demanded it, had finally crumbled. "It's my land," I said simply. "Always was." Her breath hitched. The truth wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It echoed across the lake like a slow-moving wave. As the officials dispersed, one by one, the residents lingered. Some approached me quietly, apologizing. Some didn't speak at all, just nodded with that tight-lipped shame of people realizing they'd trusted the wrong leader. A few asked if there was any way they could stay. Sarah took note of every name, every concern. She was already thinking ahead. Leases, long-term agreements, fair terms. Justice didn't need to destroy them. It needed to correct the lie. An hour later, the shoreline returned to stillness. The lake absorbed the final echoes of machinery shutting off. And for the first time in months, I heard what had been missing. Water lapping gently against stone, like it was exhaling. I walked down to the edge of the ranch's original boat dock. the old wood sun-bleached and cracked, smelling faintly of pine sap and thyme. The lake was how I remembered it, or maybe it was becoming that way again. Behind me, Bethany stood alone, arms wrapped tight across her chest, watching officials document everything she'd tried to control. Her voice finally broke through the wind. "Remy? What's going to happen to us?" I turned, but there was no bitterness in me, no need for cruelty. The land had already spoken for me. "That's up to the court," I said, "and the truth." She looked away. For the first time, she had no argument left. When the last county vehicle finally drove off and the sun dipped lower behind the mountains, I stood where the grass met the water, letting the cold air brush across my face. The lake stayed quiet, not just silent, restored, whole. It had weathered storms of ice and drought and time. Now it had weathered something else. Greed, entitlement, the arrogance of those who thought they could redraw its edges without consequence. As a breeze rippled across the surface, the water reflected the late afternoon light in shimmering gold, just like it had when my grandfather first walked here with nothing but a deed and a promise. A promise I'd kept. I closed my eyes, listening to the soft rhythm of the waves, and let the peace settle into me. Justice didn't roar. It whispered. It returned things to where they belonged. And as long as I stood on this land, my land, the lake would stay quiet. Sometimes justice is just one person standing their ground when nobody else will. If you've ever dealt with an HOA or had to fight for what's yours, drop a justice in the comments. And if you want more stories about land, courage, and folks who don't back down, feel free to subscribe and stick around.